I don't think that my ideas are new, because most of them have been discussed several times. But during the time I spent working on economics, I don't remember that there has been an issue that was totally new. So we're repeating things with the hope that the people who can take the decisions, the right decisions, can take them according to what we think is the right thing. So the objective of this speech is to contribute objectively to the ongoing national dialogue on social justice and subsidy reforms through sketching some main elements to consider while reforming subsidies, and hoping that this might help the government more closer toward achieving the goal of social justice. I have three simple messages. The first is that social justice is a much more comprehensive concept than subsidies, social safety net, and even social protection. Egypt has to decouple from the past trajectory of thinking of social justice as just the corrective measures of the negative impact of slow trickle-down effects of economic growth or of any economic reforms, including subsidy reforms. Actually, and we will see that sometimes we hear things said about social justice that are right, but sometimes it's limited to the idea of social protection and even social safety net. The second message is that Egypt has to integrate social justice into the formulation of economic policies. This requires the adoption of an inclusive growth strategy to balance between efficiency and equity, and I think this is what you were raising. Egypt's success in achieving this balance will fuel confidence in and mobilize support for the ambitious Vision 2030 strategy. The third message is that social justice should be measured objectively. If we don't measure it, we cannot manage it, and the debate will continue to be inconclusive. So I will take you through 4 parts in the presentation. The first is about what is social justice, and I think we will all agree on what will be said on this, and why to reform subsidies. And then we shed some light about what happened in Egypt, the pros and cons of the subsidy reforms in Egypt, and then some ideas about how to go for a more justice-oriented path of subsidy reform. Since 2011, justice arguments have been widely debated in Egypt within the social, political, and economic spheres, looking for a fair framework for raising the living standards and welfare of citizens and achieving economic development. Different social groups have been engaged in those arguments. So far, however, the dialogue among those groups has been too general to produce a blueprint for a well-focused and empirically informed framework for achieving social justice. This is not only because of the vague nature of the concept of justice, but also due to the absence of sufficient agreement on issues like the pragmatic definition of the notion of justice that considers the socio-economic, political, and religious realities in Egypt, how social justice could relate to the development process, the basic instrument that can relate the concept of fairness and justice to economic development. Therefore, an agreed definition for social justice is needed. This can serve as a common ground to judge what is economically just and what is not. In the absence of such a common ground, it is more difficult for individuals and agencies, academicians, to coordinate their plans efficiently in order to ensure that mutually beneficial arrangements are maintained. Social justice is a contextually bound and historically driven concept. Conceptions of justice are abstract ideas that overlap with beliefs about what is right, good, desirable, and moral. Usually, notions of social justice embrace values such as the equal worth of all citizens, their equal right to meet their basic needs, the need to spread opportunity and life chances as widely as possible, the reduction and, where possible, elimination of unjustified inequalities. There has been increased interest to measure social justice progress even in developed countries like OECD, where they developed a social justice index with 6 pillars This is to give you an idea about the various dimensions, multiple dimensions of social justice. It's not just the social protection. Part of it is poverty reduction. Part is education, health, labor market, intergenerational justice, including the debt and environment protection, and the social cohesion and non-discrimination. Part of this is political. So it depends on the country, the culture, the beliefs. These 6 pillars can be extended to 5, to 10, or can be reduced to 4, depending on the needs. But we have to agree ahead what are the pillars and what are the sub-index under each of these pillars. In Egypt, the social justice in the framework of the Sustainable Development Strategy, Egypt 2030, is comprehensive and includes 7 dimensions: economic, social, human, regional, generational, cultural, organizational. When you read them, you get fascinated. We understand that social justice is not just the social protection. It's about everything. Actually, social justice is not a social luxury or ideological slogan, but a necessity. We, as economists, we all know that social justice is necessary for social peace, cohesion of the social fabric and political stability, the sustainability of economic growth, and more broadly, economic development. There is strong evidence that this is the case. As Robert Solow said, in many ways, the more equitable the growth, the more sustainable it is likely to be, because there will be less controversy, less disagreement, less resistance, and also there is an enormous amount of talent in population that needs to be tapped. So in my view, his view, it's not only desirable that they go together, growth and equity, it is useful that they go together. So why to reform subsidies? Some subsidies are important and useful, or why basically they were introduced in the beginning. But many become, after a while, perverse and need to get reformed. When subsidies exert effects that are clearly and considerably adverse, both economically and environmentally, they become perverse. A subsidy rarely, if ever, starts perverse. Yet, over time, a legitimate, effective subsidy can become perverse or unjustifiable if it's not removed after meeting its goal or as political goals change. Perverse subsidies have been widespread in many countries, and we heard from Professor Makdisi that the amount of subsidies in our region reached 8% or more than 8% of the total GDP of the region. There are many detrimental effects of perverse subsidies. We all know about them, starting from the expensive cost on the government budget, leading to misuse and overuse of subsidized commodity. They tend to benefit the few at the expense of the many, or the rich at the expense of the poor, undermining investment decisions. Over time, government support becomes enshrined in human behavior and business decisions to the point where people become reliant on and even addicted to subsidies. People feel a sense of right. This is where we are now in Egypt. We feel in Egypt that subsidies is the right of the poor people, at least. Now we'll move to the pros and cons of subsidy reforms in Egypt. For institutional and historical reasons, Egypt, as all other MENA countries, has relied mostly on consumption subsidies for reducing inequality. This is the result of an old inherited social contract where citizens gave up right to participate in decision-making in exchange for guaranteed welfare and security. Egypt currently spent 6% of its GDP, equivalent to $121 billion, like 5 times the deficit gap that we need, the financing gap we need to run our development projects. This was spent on food and fuel subsidies since 2011. However, with the increasing pressures on the fiscal budget, increasing from almost 7% of GDP to 13% of GDP, and solid evidence that subsidies are regressive, benefiting the rich more than the poor, many reports concluded to this result. Subsidy reform became a must. And Egypt started reforming its subsidy system slowly in 2012 and has accelerated the process since 2014. There were positive results of subsidy reform. Between 2012-13 and 2017-18, food subsidies declined from 1.7% to 1.5% of GDP. Fuel subsidies declined from 6.8 to 2.7. This is 4.1 percentage points of GDP. This is exactly the same amount of the decrease in the overall fiscal deficit from 12.9 to 9%. The primary deficit turned to a surplus in fiscal year 18 for the first time since fiscal year 04. These positive developments could have been even more sizable should the Egyptian pound devaluation have not taken place in late 2016. But the poverty impact of eliminating subsidies is expected to be large. In 2004-5, 2008-9, and 2014-15, with the 3 rounds of the hikes, there were some estimates of the poverty impact of eliminating subsidies. We can see that it changed from one year to another, depending on the size of subsidies, but it is sizable. For the fuel subsidies, it was more than 6 percentage points in 2004-5. We didn't have estimate for the remaining rounds, the rounds of 2008-9 and 2014-15, but we expect, and this is just the first round effect. This is not mentioning what would happen in the second round concerning the price increases to other commodities and services. So there will be a sizable impact. How much it is, we have no idea, but the new hikes, I think, is been undertaken, and we will see the real impact. Also, the persistent double-digit inflation since 2004 must have been very harmful to all social classes. It was double digits since 2004, but peaked to above 20% in the last 2 years. Cash transfers amounts more than, increased more than, they quadrupled. So from 1 billion Egyptian pounds in fiscal year 06, it reached 15 billion in fiscal year 18. This is a large amount, but still meager as percent of GDP. This is just below half percentage point of GDP. Furthermore, the monthly payment, the average monthly payment for households receiving these cash transfers do not exceed 450 pounds per month, which is equivalent to $24 per month. Also, public spending on education and health did not increase as percent of GDP after all this subsidy elimination. And we can see it was around this 5% spending on education, but now it's 4.5, 4.3% of GDP. This is the total expenditure, government expenditure. So this is to tell you that most probably what was saved from the subsidy elimination was not spent on education and health. Also, 16% of Egyptian children are stunted, so this means that 16% of our future labor force will have problems, whether cognitive development, school achievement, economic productivity, and maternal reproductive outcomes. Also, public debt increased to unprecedented levels as percent of GDP at the level of 90%. This is the net public debt. And we have 41% of GDP as external debt. So some of the, I wouldn't be fair if I say that definitely the impact of subsidy reform is against social justice, because I don't have a measure. We have scattered indicators that tell that we may not be on the right track. But we need a comprehensive index that tells us whether we are on the right track or not. And as we saw in the social justice index of the EU, some of the pillars take double weighted or triple weighted. So it depends on the weight we will give to each of the pillars. So toward a justice-oriented path, while there is no single recipe for successful subsidy reform, country experiences suggested that the following ingredients are needed. A comprehensive subsidy reform plan with clear long-term objectives and an evaluation, meaning measuring of the impact of reforms. This is especially true in the case of non-marginal and accelerated reforms. Subsidies cannot be taken away without clear, sustainable plans to protect the poor and also the middle class. For example, fuel subsidies need to be phased out as part of a broader transition to clean energy. Adoption of the stakeholder approach to reform, thus avoiding an undue burden of any single group, and initiate transparent mass information campaigns for explaining to the public the benefits of price subsidy reform. By extensive communication and consultation with stakeholders, we mean that it should be a two-way communication, send and receive, talk and listen. I think what we're seeing now is an advertising campaign rather than a communication campaign. Communication not only of information on the size of subsidies and how they affect the government budget, but also on price increases that are phased in over time, eligibility criteria for the remaining subsidies, and how and when various economic policies will compensate for all possible negative implications. We need to improve the efficiency in public utilities to reduce the cost or price of public goods and services. All now public goods have been liberalized, the prices have been liberalized. Institutional reforms that depoliticize energy pricing, such as the introduction of automatic pricing mechanism. Measures to protect temporarily the poor and vulnerable through targeted cash or near cash transfers, or if this option is not feasible, a focus on existing targeted programs that can be expanded quickly. And we did this in Egypt with Takaful and Karama, but to my opinion, without focusing as well on developing inclusive growth, I think Takaful and Karama are not sustainable because they will not be able to cover all the hurt people, neither in the numbers of poor or in the amounts they need to go protect themselves. More importantly, we need a paradigm shift in social policies in the context of a new social contract. This is true in general and in social protection policy and subsidies in particular. A paradigm shift in social protection means that instead of being a corrective measure, social protection in this context becomes a transformative tool that can empower people, especially the poor, and enable them to become development actors rather than only service beneficiaries. This change should be accompanied by inclusive and sustainable economic strategies that governance reforms that integrate the principles of equality, equity, rights and participation upon which social justice rests. For example, this is what we have been saying, the balance between efficiency and social justice. This was a graph that was supposed to be part of Egypt Human Development Report of 2015, supposedly, on social justice, telling us that inclusive growth entails these different dimensions. One of them is social protection. So working just on social protection will not help the country to protect the poor or even to protect the middle class to remain as a middle class. This, I think, my message is clear. It's easy to criticize and to recommend. It's very difficult to translate this into policy actions and to implement this. We hope by getting a consensus on what we need to do in our countries, we can push our governments to undertake quickly what will lead the country to a better future. Thank you very much.